These are some of the most disturbing crimes that happen in the World of Warcraft community, and as this video goes on, each one only gets worse. On November 20th, 2017, Kalin Mateas had a debt to settle, and along with two other people, he boarded a plane in Romania. Their flight was headed to the US and would take just over 20 hours. But what Kalin knew was that his past was about to catch up with him, and there was nothing he could do about it. Kalin was born in 1979 or early 1980 and raised in Bucharest, Romania, a time that many Romanians called its darkest decade. But to understand this time, we need to take a step back into the country's history. Romania's former president, Nicolae Ceausescu, was 47 years old when he became the leader of an already communistic government on March 22nd, 1965. And when he did, he tightened the control over ordinary people even more and pushed politics that made life even harder for them. By the 1970s, Nicolae had started to borrow money from Western countries to build factories and modernize Romania. But when the country had to pay back those loans, things became difficult. He decided to try to pay everything Romania owed back quickly, and while that happened, the people suffered. The government controlled almost everything: food, electricity, jobs, and people's daily lives. People literally froze and starved in the dark. But 24 years later, in November 1989, the Romanian people had enough, and they rose up against the government. On December 25th, 1989, after a quick trial, the president and his wife were executed by a Romanian military firing squad. And when that happened, the Romanian people could finally enjoy freedom again. In the 1990s, things changed suddenly. Romania built its internet from scratch, which soon became the fastest in the world, and internet cafes opened their doors across Bucharest, the capital of Romania. It took around 10 years for Romania's modern tech industry to really take off, and when it did, their online systems had almost no real security standards, and so teenagers like Kalin were able to experiment with all sorts of things without really worrying about ever being caught. Between 2001 and 2003, a thriving hacker community grew in Romania. Inside online chat rooms, tech-savvy teens connected and swapped online weaknesses and hacking tips and tricks they'd found. When Kalin first joined the hacker community, he used the online alias Metal, but as his reputation grew, he chose a somewhat darker one, Dr. Mengele, the name of the Nazi doctor who tortured Jewish people in Holocaust concentration camps. Kalin was an intelligent teenager who wanted the world to know his name, and in 1997, 17-year-old Kalin spoke to a Romanian newspaper where he boasted about how he had hacked into US government intelligence agencies like the FBI and NASA. Now, Kalin spent his earlier years breaking into websites and changing how they looked, but by 1999, the 19-year-old was looking for something a little more profitable, and so he set his sights on Ingram Micro, which was a Fortune 500 tech supplier in Santa Ana, California. Once Kalin had accessed their system, he found a flaw that let him create fake customer accounts that looked so legit that they passed the company's security checks. He got to work, created accounts, and then placed orders for computer servers, processors, and networking hardware. And Ingram Micro, completely unaware that the system had been breached, processed every one of those orders and shipped them straight to Romania. And when Ingram Micro realized that they had a problem, they blocked deliveries to Eastern Europe. But Kalin had another plan. He used online chat rooms and found people from the US who were willing to work with him. Four of Kalin's first American recruits pulled others into their operation. Some of them were only high school students, but the job wasn't a difficult one. They would receive the packages at their home, then sell the equipment in the US and wire the money back to Kalin in Romania. Or if they couldn't sell the goods fast enough, they'd box them up and ship them directly to him. Now Kalin kept ordering goods, and over 4 years, he placed more than 2,000 fake orders. Fortunately enough for Ingram Micro, they were able to stop about half of those orders before they went out. Now the company then investigated the suspicious orders and traced them back to their customer accounts and login records. And that's when investigators noticed that there was a pattern. Dozens of US addresses were all receiving the same equipment over and over again. So Ingram Micro eventually contacted the FBI, who then found and questioned the people in the US who were working with Kalin. Some of them confessed and handed over their chat logs, usernames, and even payment details. And this information led authorities to the mastermind of the scheme in Bucharest. And this is when the FBI and Romanian National Police joined forces. Back in the US on August 4th, 2004, 24-year-old Kalin was charged with using the US mail to commit a crime. And this legal decision was made in Los Angeles by a federal grand jury, a group of citizens whose job was to decide whether he'd committed a crime. The charges against him were serious and meant he could spend up to 90 years in prison. But he wasn't the only one charged. His US accomplices were also charged. Among them were Jeremy Long and Warren Bailey. If they were found guilty, they could spend up to 35 years in prison too. Later, another 11 criminal charges were also made public in Pennsylvania for the packages that had been sent to addresses in Pennsylvania, Georgia, and Louisiana. All of Kalin's accomplices who were charged in America faced their charges, but he didn't, because he was destination, again Romania, and US officials couldn't touch him for his crimes. Not yet anyway. But the FBI worked with the Romanian police, and international agencies tracked him down, built their case, and waited to make their next move. When Romanian authorities eventually caught up with Călin in August 2004, he was living a life of luxury. During a raid on his home, investigators seized some of his assets, which included a BMW M3 Cabrio, a BMW 520i, a BMW X5, and $117,000 in cash. But even though he'd been charged, hunted, and raided by law enforcement, that didn't stop Călin. He simply kept on hacking. About 7 years after Călin had spoken to the newspaper about hacking the FBI, the internet as people knew it was really changing, and online gaming had become huge. And when World of Warcraft launched on November 23, 2004, it didn't take long for it to become the biggest online game on the planet. Between 2009 and 2010, World of Warcraft was in its golden age and had 12 million players. The aim of World of Warcraft was to create and develop your in-game character over time by completing quests, improving the gear that your character had, and taking on different challenges like dungeons and raids. World of Warcraft was played across many servers, which meant that the game wasn't all on one single shared world. It was split into many separate versions of the game called servers or realms. Each server had its group of players, and these players usually interacted and played with others on the same server. So if two players were on different servers, they usually couldn't see or interact with each other in the same world. Now many players on the same servers formed guilds, which were groups that worked together to complete dungeons and raids. In these guilds, rare loot was valuable, and a loot council decided based on performance and players' contributions who received it. Now when Călin, who was approaching his 30s and a fugitive now, discovered World of Warcraft on the European servers, it really drew him in. Just like the Ingram micro scheme, it was something he could work on for years to come, and so he joined guilds and took part in high-level missions for rewards. But the rewards were scarce. Raids like Icecrown Citadel could only be cleared once a week, and with many players wanting the same item, there was always a loser, and those that lost sometimes had to wait months for another chance to get those rewards. Then, in Wrath of the Lich King, a major World of Warcraft expansion that was launched in 2008, players and their guilds competed for rewards, and server first, which was a respected accomplishment. Server first meant being the first guild on a server to complete a major milestone, like defeating a raid boss before other guilds on that server did, and when a server went down, the game stopped working. That meant all groups and raids stopped, and literally all players were wiped out. For the average player, losing a drop was just part of the game, and you keep playing. But for Călin, this was a huge problem that needed to be solved. When a loot council overlooked his contributions, or when a rival guild was about to beat his team to a server first kill, he didn't lock off. He reached for a different kind of power. He carried out DDoS attacks against Blizzard's European servers. From February to September 2010, Călin used a botnet, a server of hacked computers he controlled remotely, to flood Blizzard servers with more traffic than it could handle. This fake traffic crashed the servers, and entire guilds went offline. Now at the time of Călin's attacks, Blizzard was pulling in over $100 million a month, and according to the US Department of Justice, his disruptions cost the company $29,987. The overtime for IT staff's emergency response had to be paid, and the ongoing network repairs also cost money. Fortunately, once Blizzard started to look for the source of the problem, they found a trail that led right back to Călin, and they intended to make him pay for the damage he had caused them. On December 9, 2011, a grand jury in California charged Călin because he accessed a computer without permission to steal data or cause damage, and for this he could spend up to 10 years in prison. Now because Călin was already wanted for the 2004 case, this new charge only made the situation worse, and for the next 6 years, US authorities fought hard to get Călin returned to the United States so he could actually pay for his crimes. Fortunately for them, on January 4, 2017, the Bucharest Court of Appeal approved their request to have him sent to the US. Back in Romania, authorities had closed in on Călin, and on January 7, 2017, a Romanian court found him guilty on his first charge, and he had to pay Ingram Micro $1,064,872.14 in damages. This payment was handed through the FBI's legal office. Călin said he was innocent and claimed that technical experts showed he wasn't the one who accessed the Ingram Micro site, but the Romanian judges didn't believe him. And so finally, after about 13 years, on Monday, November 20th, 2017, 37-year-old Călin boarded a plane in Romania and was escorted by 2 law enforcement officers back to the United States. And once the plane landed in Los Angeles and he set foot on US soil, he was arrested for the 2004 charges. Then, almost 3 months later, on February 14th, 2018, Călin appeared in a Los Angeles court where he pleaded guilty to the charges against him for the World of Warcraft service attacks back in 2010. The court ordered Călin to pay another $29,987 to Blizzard Entertainment to make up for the losses. But in return for admitting his guilt, the earlier charges for the 2004 Ingram charges were dropped, and as a result, he avoided a possible 9-year prison sentence in the US. About 3 months later, on Monday, May 7th, 2018, Călin returned to a court in California. A government lawyer who specialized in online crime asked that Călin be sentenced to 10 months in prison, but the defense argued that he'd already spent 6 months there and that he should be released. Now, despite the defense request, US District Judge Otis D. Wright II sentenced Călin to 1 year in prison for the harm his attacks caused to thousands thousands of World of Warcraft players. And so at 38, he became an inmate at the SeaTac Federal Detention Center in Washington. But because Khalid had already been in prison since November 20th, 2017, he only served another 6 months after he was sentenced. And so on November 6, 2018, he walked out a free man and disappeared. The teenager who'd bragged about hacking the FBI, a $10 million fraud case, years of investigation, and an international manhunt, and what brought it all down in the end was a video game. Prosecutors explained his motive in their sentencing statement as being a juvenile desire to win the game, and for others to lose it. Now, when players create hardcore characters in World of Warcraft, they literally have to accept this warning. By agreeing to play on these realms, you accept that your character's death is permanent for whatever the reason. This includes disconnections, lags, server outages, gameplay bugs, or any other reason. Now, when server attacks hit World of Warcraft, they ruined the game for everyone playing at the moment. The next case was different. The damage was planned, deliberate, and much harder to undo, and cost the people involved more money than they anticipated. Inside a building in Liano district, Li Shui, Zhejiang province, men were working hard to earn a living. Somebody named Chen had decided to start a buy and resell operation in a system where buyers and sellers were already in place. It was May 2013 when Chen rented a small gaming studio in Zhejiang. He set up computers and hired workers. And once the studio was ready and the workers in place, he bought stolen World of Warcraft accounts. And that's where his team came in. Chen gave the team the account details, and they stripped each account of every single asset it had, gold, gear, and rare items. And those assets were then sold for real money. But there was more money to be made, because the emptied accounts could also be sold. According to RT Live, Chen bought the accounts for around 6 RMB or $1 each, and the emptied accounts for about 20 RMB or $3 each. Now Chen's business started to do well when one of his teammates, Zhu, left and set up his own studio. He'd learned enough and knew exactly how things worked, and now there were 2 operations running, with 8 workers split between them. All of the 10 men were making money from World of Warcraft players. Now on Chinese World of Warcraft servers, millions of players were online, questing, fighting, and building their characters. Some of these players had spent years playing the game, and others had played the game for just a few months. Now around June 22nd and 23rd, 2013, many Chinese players tried to log in, only to find out that they couldn't access their accounts. Other players got in, but their gold, gear, and mounts had gone missing overnight. In an article on Medium, one player described what a moment like this would feel like. Everything I had owned and collected for over 4 years had been sold. It's like I woke up with a pile of stolen money. Now reports flooded NetEase, the company that operated World of Warcraft in China back in 2013, and soon even police stations across Zhejiang province had reports coming in, so many in fact that they had no choice but to find out what was going on. Now investigators cross-referenced players' accounts that had been hacked, and they found a pattern. These accounts had all been accessed and stripped in the same way, from a cluster of IP addresses in the same area in Zhejiang, and soon the police knew exactly who they were looking for, Chen and Zhu, and they moved in quickly on both studios. Chen and Zhu and 3 of their team members named Ma, Zi, and Wang were arrested first, and the other 5 workers were tracked down and arrested later. The police seized the entire operation's computers and equipment and the money that they had made, and all the 10 men were charged for getting into a computer or network without permission. The case went to trial at the Songyang County Court, and all 10 men were found guilty. On Friday, December 20th, 2013, the men were sentenced. Because Chen was the ringleader of the entire operation, he got the heaviest punishment, 2 years in prison and an $8,000 fine. Zhu and the other 8 men were each sentenced to just under 2 years in prison, and each had a $1,000 fine. Now news about the arrest spread, and just 4 days after the team had been sentenced on December 24th, 2013, GameSpeed reported that almost 11,500 World of Warcraft players had their account logins and in-game assets stolen. But while Blizzard Entertainment had a recovery process in place, whether or not players got their account assets actually back depended on proof and timing. World of Warcraft players had to actually prove that their accounts belonged to them by giving their registration info, CD keys, or security questions. And Blizzard even logged some accounts and tried to restore the stolen items. But if too much time had passed, logs were incomplete, or a player couldn't prove that they owned a particular account, and so it couldn't actually be restored to them. Now while some players were fortunate and got everything back, others lost it all for good. Now GameSpeed, an online gaming news platform, was not the only one who had something to say about this case. 10 days later, on December 30th, 2012, David Hing shared an online article about Chen, Zhu, and his team, but the writer took the story to a whole new level when he shared this. There's an outside possibility that in jail, the team may encounter Warcraft again. Back in 2011, it was revealed by The Guardian that some Chinese prisoners were being forced to farm gold as part of their sentences. Now when David said farm gold, he did not mean that the prisoners were forced to literally dig up real gold. What he meant was the prisoners would be forced to do repetitive World of Warcraft in-game tasks to earn virtual gold, which would then be sold outside the game for real money. Now a few people reacted to the story. One person commented, "Time well spent," and another said, "Bet they play WoW in jail, gold farming to pay off their fine and each other." Then another person said, "Forced to farm gold in a prison as part of their sentences. I don't know about you, but if I landed myself in prison, I don't care how mundane it is overall. I don't think I'd really have to be forced to play any computer game." Now World of Warcraft had 7.6 million active subscribers worldwide when Chen's operation was shut down. But they weren't running some rogue operation. They were only two parts of a well-oiled machine. 6 years before Chen started his gold farming operation, operations like his were already a huge problem. In 2008, it had been estimated that up to 1 million people in China worked as gold farmers. Now, under Blizzard's terms of service, gold farming, account trading, and item sales weren't allowed. But that didn't stop World of Warcraft players from doing it anyway. And all of these were done pretty openly in online auctions, forums, and dedicated unofficial sites. And people made real money as they traded. In community polls and surveys, roughly 30 to 50% of World of Warcraft players admitted that they'd bought gold from third-party sellers like Chen, and that if they hadn't yet, they were seriously considering doing it. For Chen and Zhu, stolen World of Warcraft accounts were inventory. But in the next case, players are the inventory, and one partner becomes suspicious of the other, costing them everything.
我们纯是不是为了赚钱，纯粹为了娱乐，大家在一起这么多人。
Li and Zhang were both from Shanglu County outside Chengdu. The two joined forces and rented a small office where they opened a World of Warcraft gold farming operation. Then the men hired more than 20 low-wage workers. Most of them were young people who needed to earn steady pay and have a roof over their heads. The master behind the entire gold farming operation was Li. He pushed the workers hard, 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, so that he could get the most out of them. His partner Zhang managed the workers and kept the business's finances in order. Now the workers of this gold farming operation logged into World of Warcraft every day and completed tasks to earn gold by fighting enemies, collecting items, and running dungeons. They knew their job was to earn as much virtual gold as possible to sell to random players worldwide. Some workers barely left the building and their shifts were long. They got barely any sleep and their breaks were pretty short too. Now the entire gold farming operation ran on World of Warcraft's Chinese servers, and worldwide there are many players eager to take shortcuts if it meant they could get ahead in the game. And gold farming operations like these were kept alive by people who didn't mind buying digital currency online. Now Li's and Zhang's operations were just one tiny piece of China's huge, mostly unregulated gold farming industry. Researchers estimated that gold farming operations supplied a significant portion of World of Warcraft's illegal currency worldwide. In 2008, China's trade in virtual currency was estimated to be worth several billion yuan, about $300 million. Now, despite the high demand for virtual gold in World of Warcraft, workers sometimes earned as little as 10 yuan for every 100 gold coins they collected. Their bosses then resold the same coins to online buyers for $3 or more, since players were willing to pay up to $20 for them. Now, a report from Warrant showed that from late 2007 through March of 2008, Li and Zhang's operation alone earned roughly 1.6 million RMB, about 230,000 US dollars in their first 7 months, which is about $33,000 a month. About 9 months after they started their gold farming operation, the partnership between Li and Zhang started to turn sour though. In early May 2008, Li became suspicious. Every transaction looked kinda wrong, and the numbers just seemed off. He spotted inconsistencies in their finances and believed Zhang was keeping a larger share of the profit, and their suspicion turned to open hostility. Li could have confronted Zhang directly or walked away. Instead, he chose another path. Li went to the police and filed a formal complaint against Zhang for the unfair distribution of profits. And once Li complained to the Shanglu County Police, the future of their entire gold farming operation was out of his hands. Li exposed everything: the accounts, workers, money, and himself. And so the police, of course, raided the workshop, seized every computer, and arrested both Li and Zhang, and shut down the entire operation. Now, after this happened, players noticed changes in their World of Warcraft in-game markets, which are called auction houses. Inside these auction houses, players used the in-game gold that they had earned to buy items like the weapons, armor, and rare drops they needed to play the game. And suddenly, the prices for these items became steady because there was less bulk buying and selling going on. The usual farming areas where players earned in-game rewards were also no longer as crowded because fewer people were actually farming. But for the workers of this operation, the impact was a little more serious. Their home and income disappeared overnight, and some workers left the building with no idea where they were going next. And the Shanglu raid is the most famous example of China's first big move against online crime. And after the first raid, Blizzard stepped up gold farming bans worldwide and upgraded its anti-cheat system in 2008 and 2009. Now, no one knows what actually happened to Li and Zhang after their arrests. There were no trial records and no sentencing was ever reported. Now, Li had kind of brought the shutdown of the operation on himself. The next case, however, cost some victims money and something far harder to recover from: the sense of safety they felt for themselves and their families. One night back in 2010, Daniel, a 12-year-old from southwest Wales, was deep into a World of Warcraft PvP match. It was around 10:30 PM, later than most kids his age should have been awake. But this boy wasn't going to sleep anytime soon. He was about to learn some pretty awesome internet tricks, and didn't anticipate how costly these discoveries would be. Daniel Kelly was born in 1997 and came from a pretty ordinary family in the small town of Llanelli, Carmarthenshire. He was a withdrawn kid who barely showed up at school, and while he didn't do well at school, there was something he was really good at: playing World of Warcraft. He enjoyed the game so much that he spent up to 14 hours a day playing it. In the game, out of millions of players, Daniel had already achieved top 20 PvP status. He was a healer who played a holy paladin and restoration druid. His job was to keep other players alive during battles and dungeon runs. But there was a darker and more competitive side to some of the World of Warcraft players. Sometimes rival players in the game used tools to track players' IPs through Skype, and then they would flood their connections with junk traffic to knock them offline. Now, the first time this happened to Daniel, he was pretty shocked. When players started to freeze and his game wouldn't respond, he knew that he'd become a target. But he fought back and learned to use Skype IP resolvers to get his opponent's addresses, and even bought DDoS stressor tools to hit them back. Now, for the first time, World of Warcraft was about more than just winning. He wanted control. Daniel continued playing the game for a while after that, but eventually actually quit because he became frustrated by how openly top players cheated. Now, in August 2013, Daniel received his exam results and discovered that he'd failed. Now, this was a tough setback for him because it meant that he'd have to stay at a lower level and that he wouldn't be able to do the computing course at his college that he wanted to. Now, Daniel's World of Warcraft DDoS attacks were kind of a sign of skill, which he chose to develop. And so at about 13 years old, he hacked his very first website and changed the picture on it. His picture of choice was a little trolley.
So it was like some stupid picture. It was like, I think it was like, do you know the picture of the troll face?
Yeah.
Daniel left the troll face on that website for a couple of days and then removed it. But the experience had given him a sense of euphoria and felt like a major achievement. He wanted that feeling again, and so he looked for the next website he could get into. Soon he found a cross-site scripting flaw, a website weakness that lets attackers sneak harmful code into a page and run it in other people's browsers without them knowing. And he actually reported it to Microsoft. Daniel actually got some recognition for doing that, and from there he found vulnerabilities in several Fortune 500 companies' websites. But when he reported them, he didn't get any credit for it. And from there on, Daniel kept records of and reported every vulnerability he found. But when he realized that he was receiving little to no recognition for his skills, he felt like he was wasting his time. So soon, Daniel joined hacker forums and started to share what he'd found there. Now, not all these hackers were ethical though, and some used this information themselves. In a sense, Daniel finally got the recognition he was looking for, because the forum hackers really appreciated the information that he shared with them. Now, between September 2013 and April 2014, Daniel carried out over 40 DDoS attacks on the college he attended. According to BBC News, Daniel admitted that his motive for doing this was almost laughable. He wanted to skip class. But the college shared its network with local hospitals as well, and when Daniel took their site down, it caused real damage. The radiology systems at Willie Bush General and Prince Philip hospitals went down, and patients who needed emergency scans couldn't get them. Now, local councils and emergency services were also knocked offline, and at the end of the day, fixing the issue that Daniel had cost over £400,000, around $611,000. Now, by early 2014, Daniel's motives then turned to financial gain. He used Google searches to find ways of breaking into a website's database to steal their data. He then used the data he stole to target companies across 3 continents. And in February of 2014, Daniel and a hacker group called Team Hands went after a company called Rogers Communication in Canada, and they were hit the hardest. Daniel and the team broke into the company's systems and stole private employee records and contracts. And once they had this information, they sent a threatening email to Rogers Communications vice president, in which they named his 1-year-old son and demanded 25 bitcoins, approximately $13,500 at the time, but of course a bit more in nowadays standards. They also told the employee that they were looking at photos of his son. Now, to repair the security problems and network after the data was stolen cost the company between $400,000 and £580,000. But they were just one of the dozen companies that Daniel, sometimes working alone and others with the team, hit. They also attacked an Australian hobby retailer, a London cigar shop, and a UK IT firm, basically any company with a vulnerability, and they demanded Bitcoin ransoms that ranged from £1,000 to £10,000 from each of them. Daniel's ransom messages threatened companies and the people who worked for them. He told executives that their children would be in danger if they didn't pay up. The people who received these threats were of course frightened. They had no idea who they were dealing with, and so Daniel made a few £1,000s out of it. On Thursday, July 2nd, 2015, the Welsh cybercrime unit arrested Daniel for the college DDoS attacks, but fortunately for him, he was released on bail and allowed to go home. But despite that, he still hadn't learned his lesson and didn't stop hacking. 3 months later, in October 2015, now 18 years old, Daniel found a website weakness that let him type special commands into login or search boxes on the TalkTalk website. And when he made this discovery, he and 10 other hackers tricked the TalkTalk website into giving him access to their database. And once the hackers were in their systems, they pulled 157,000 customer records that contained customer names, email addresses, dates of births, and even their financial details.
4 million customers may have seen their personal information, such as names, credit cards, and bank details, stolen by hackers. The circumstances remain unclear and an investigation is ongoing.
On October 21st, 2015, Daniel took things a step further and emailed TalkTalk CEO Dido Harding. In this email, he demanded 465 Bitcoin, approximately £80,000 at the time, from her in exchange for not leaking their company data. Now, Dido did not pay the ransom demand. Instead, on October 22nd, 2015, she contacted Scotland Yard and the National Crime Agency, and a criminal investigation was launched. Next, she reached out to BBC News and had an interview with them in which she confirmed that she'd been contacted by the nameless and at the time faceless hacker with a ransom demand.
It's a live criminal investigation. All I can say is that I had and personally received a contact from someone purporting, as I say, I don't know whether they are or are not, to be the hacker looking for money.
Now, the TalkTalk hack was huge. Approximately 4 million customers were told that their personal data could have been compromised, and the news of this data leak impacted the company badly. They lost between 95,000 and 101,000 customers, and their share price also dropped overnight by 10% once the data leak was made public on the 22nd of October 2015. Now, in the end, the total cost of the TalkTalk customer data leak was around £77 million. At the time, that was around $126 million. It took the company brand a while to recover from the damage as well. But after the incident, there were investigations done, and the entire leak was traced back to an 18-year-old in South Wales. Now, when the TalkTalk incident was traced back to Daniel, he was still out on bail. But on Tuesday, November 24th, 2015, the Metropolitan Police arrested 18-year-old Daniel for a second time, this time for the TalkTalk hack and the blackmail campaign. Now, there were 2 investigations into Daniel that told a story of the real scope of his criminal activity. According to Cybercrime magazine, Daniel's attacks on companies had cost an estimated £100 million in damages. And just over a year later, on Tuesday, December 13th, 2016, Daniel was facing 30 charges and pleaded guilty to 11 of those. These charges covered everything from illegal system access to blackmail and fraud. From December 2016 to June 2019, Daniel was out on conditional bail and waiting to be sentenced. For Daniel, this meant he could stay out of prison while waiting for a trial, as long as he followed strict rules like avoiding the internet and not using certain programming tools. Then eventually, about 2.5 years later, on Monday, June 10th, 2019, Daniel was sentenced at the Old Bailey, the Central Criminal Court in London. Since his guilty plea in 2016, he'd struggled with depression and weight loss, and had actually been diagnosed with Asperger's syndrome, a condition that affects how a person communicates and interacts with others. The people with it usually have normal or above average intelligence, and may find social situations confusing, prefer routines, or become hyper-focused on their specific interests. Judge Mark Dennis QC described Daniel's actions as prolific, skilled, and cynical. Prosecutors said that he could face up to 12.5 years, but when it came time for Daniel to be sentenced, the judge took a few things into consideration. Firstly, his age at the time of the crimes, then the fact that he pleaded guilty to the charges against him, and lastly, the judge was impressed by what Daniel had been doing with his time. In the 2 years he was out on bail, he'd been reporting online vulnerabilities, and so Daniel was sentenced to only 4 years in a young offenders institution, but only served about 2 of them. He served time at HMP Belmarsh, a high-security facility that normally houses terrorism inmates in London. After that, he was transferred to HMP Berwyn and HMP Bristol. In 2021, Daniel was then released and went straight toward hacking again, but ethically this time. On Saturday, May 7, 2022, Daniel posted this on Twitter. There's a common misconception that many cyber criminals get caught, go to prison, and a government comes along and scoops it up. This was Daniel's way of pushing back on the idea that getting caught leads to a government job. Just after the Twitter post on June 16, 2022, Daniel told Computer Daily about his 2 arrests. He said he really wasn't expecting the first arrest, and it was over in less than 5 hours. But the second arrest felt like something out of a movie, and was more serious. According to him, there were several agencies waiting for me at my house. I was taken to my local police station by 2 police cars, while sitting in the back of an unmarked police van. It was a high-profile case, so they cleared out the police holding area and rushed me through. By 2025, 26-year-old Daniel now had reported over 5,900 vulnerabilities through reward systems, where companies pay people for finding and reporting security flaws in their software or websites. He also found many new security flaws and reported these to cybersecurity teams without taking any credit for it. Now, Daniel estimated that after his release, his vulnerability disclosures alone had saved organizations over £100 million, which would be over $125 million US today. To this day, the blackmail phase of his criminal career and threatening people's children was the part that he couldn't get over.
Daniel Kelly was the teenager behind the TalkTalk hack. It's a mistake that'll hang over him for the rest of his life, but he still can't believe the real-world consequences of his cyber activities.
Daniel said he traced it all back to the beginning, which was World of Warcraft, his gateway drug. the place back in 2010 where he first saw how common cheating was among top players, and where his curiosity for finding and exploiting weaknesses really started. He said, "I didn't choose to get into computer hacking or cybersecurity. It just happened when I was a teenager. I didn't wake up and make a rational decision." In 2025, Daniel posted this rather entertaining clip on LinkedIn, which really is food for thought. Today, Daniel's ranked 11th in the world for stopping hacking. From behind a keyboard, Daniel Kelly's crimes cost companies and himself a lot. But in the next case, the exploitation was face-to-face, approved by the state and not escapable.
If the label says made in China, what it doesn't say is made in China by prisoners in forced labor camps.
Within months of World of Warcraft's launch on Tuesday, November 23rd, 2004, it had millions of players, and they all needed gold. Players built their characters, fought enemies, and earned gold, which bought them gear, upgrades, and survival. But earning that gold took time. A lot of time. And so within the first year of the game's launch, players around the world were buying gold instead of playing the game to earn it. And because of this, gold farming was born. Now gold farming became very profitable for those doing it, and by 2005 to 2006, reports of what these gold farms looked like became public. Crowded rooms with 20 to 40 workers pulling 12-hour shifts, who were paid a fraction of what their American buyers made in an hour. Now the average virtual gold farm was a private business, but this one wasn't. Dali Louis was a 54-year-old former prison guard who'd worked in Chinese prisons for many years. In 2004, he made a terrible mistake though. He reported local officials to the central Chinese government for abusing power, taking bribes, or misusing public resources. And while Dali was not a criminal, when he asked the government to take a closer look at what was happening, he ended up being sentenced to 3 years of re-education through labor. In China, the re-education system is a system where the government puts people in prison to be rehabilitated. These sentences are also handed down to Chinese citizens without them getting a fair trial though. And so Dali was sentenced at Jixi, number 7 detention center, a facility in Heilongjiang in the northeast corner of China. For Dali and other prisoners, their day-to-day routine was a nightmare. They'd spend days breaking rocks and digging cold trenches. Now prisoners were also forced to carve toothpicks and chopsticks for export and assemble car seat covers bound for South Korea and Japan. Now the hours of labor left their hands raw and bags spent, but the physical labor was only half of it. Every day, prisoners were also forced to memorize communist literature to prove that their thinking had been corrected. Now the exact date wasn't known, but sometime in the years after Dali arrived, guards at Jixi set up a room with rows of computers in it, and the screens ran day and night non-stop, and behind those computers were people who had no choice of whether they wanted to be there or not. After a day of physical labor, prisoners had to enter the room with the computers and work 12-hour shifts at night playing World of Warcraft. They kill low-level enemies, collect resources, and grind, of course, for gold. Now prison guards set strict targets for how much in-game currency each prisoner had to earn each shift, and if they didn't meet those targets, they'd be beaten with plastic pipes or have to stand with their arms raised until their bodies gave out. Now the gold was sold through black market sites. The prison guards sent their internet connection through other servers, so their real connection was hidden and harder to track, and this helped them stay one step ahead of Blizzard's banned systems. Now Dali served a sentence and was released from Jixi in 2007, but the nightmares of his experience at Jixi stayed with him. He believed that his story is not only his to tell, and that gold farming in prisons happened throughout northeast China. Jixi's gold farming operation was part of an enormous gold farming industry. By 2008, China was responsible for about 80% of the world's gold farming. In 2009, China made unlicensed virtual currency trading illegal, but enforcement of that rule wasn't really guaranteed. Then in 2011, a gamer was actually imprisoned for stealing 3,000 RMB, around $450, in virtual credits, while prison operations still moved thousands of times that amount and got away with it. Now 4 years after he was released from prison in 2011, Dali spoke to a journalist under a fake name, and the story appeared under the headline, "China used prisoners in lucrative internet gaming work," on Wednesday, May 25th, 2011. Dali described a shift in a single sentence. "We kept playing until we could barely see." He went on to say, "Prison bosses made more money forcing inmates to play games than they did forcing people to do manual labor. There were 300 prisoners forced to play games. We worked 12-hour shifts in the camp. I heard them say they could earn 5,000 to 6,000 RMB a day. That's roughly $770 to $925 at 2011 exchange rates. But we didn't see any of the money, and the computers were never turned off." This was the last thing he publicly said about his Jixi prison experience. And within hours of the story breaking, outlets like the LA Times ran the story. But Blizzard Entertainment, the company whose game these prisoners were being forced to play, never said anything publicly. Now, it was hard for Dali to speak out about his experience because he knew that China classified how prisons were run as state secrets, and that going public could invite retaliation from a system that had already shown him exactly what it was capable of. Now, Blizzard had entire systems dedicated to hunting these gold farmers. They had automated detections and IP bans, but the accounts their systems were chasing didn't belong to players. They belonged to prisoners who had no choice but to be there. Now, a researcher named Jin Gi, who studied China's virtual goods industry at UC San Diego, described what the wider gold farming world looked like. China is the factory of virtual goods. You would see some exploitation where employees make workers play 12 hours a day. They have no rest throughout the year. These are not just problems for this industry, but general social problems. The pay is better than what they would get in a factory. Buyers of virtual goods have mixed feelings. It saves them time buying online credits from China. In this statement, Jin was describing the commercial industry, workers who were at least paid something for the work they were doing. The digital labor paid actual money, but the prisoners received none of it. And online, the reaction was immediate. On Reddit, under the title post, "Today I learned that prisoners were forced to farm gold and WoW, which then would get sold for real money on the internet." And one Reddit user wrote, "This makes me feel kinda bad. I purchased gold a few times back when I played WoW, but I didn't know that it was slaves doing it. I thought it was just high-level players making money from the game. I guess I'm part of the pile too." Now, on Wednesday, November 15, 2013, China officially shut down the re-education through the labor system. Cases like Ren Zhanzhu, a university graduate who was put in prison in 2011 for posting critical comments about the government online, made the international pressure impossible to ignore. And so tens of thousands of detainees were released, and many facilities were repurposed as drug treatment centers.
我想民主和法治是不可分割的。中国要想实现真正的完全的法治，可能是需要民主也同时健全的时候啊，所以短期内可能看不到这种迹象，这种希望啊。
But in 2023, France 24 News shared this, which shows that re-education centers in China are definitely not a thing of the past.
Uyghur Muslims detained in camps like these, those who attempt to flee, targeted by a shoot-to-kill policy. Just some of the details revealed by data hacked from police computer servers in China.
Now, Dali always believed that gold farming went deeper than Jixi, but no investigation confirmed it and no one was ever charged. The prisoners at Jixi were at least adults, or at least the state chose its victims that way, but the next case didn't.
Every family tries to find that perfect balance between school, chores, and fun for their kids. Now, add video games into that mix and sometimes it gets complicated.
Video games are becoming more addictive by the day, so how much is too much?
Someone called the Anaheim Police Department on May 20th, 2013. The caller asked officers to do a welfare check at a mobile home. Police went, and what they found haunted them for years to come. Lester Lewis and Petra Hartmeyer lived in Anaheim, California, home to Disneyland and the average kid's dream destination. They were married, in their late 30s, and pretty private people. Few people had actually met Petra, and those who had said she never gave too much detail about herself, and told them that she came from Germany and wasn't allowed to leave the country. Neither Lester nor Petra had jobs, and there are no records that they ever did. They also didn't have a criminal record. The couple had two girls who were either their daughters or just in their care who lived with them. I'll call them Clara and Lily. On Friday, May 21st, 2010, Lester and Petra closed the door to their mobile home and went inside. The couple then turned their computers on and logged on to their favorite game, World of Warcraft. Fortunately, the girls were pretty easy to take care of, and they had toys to keep themselves entertained. Gradually, what started out as only playing their game for an hour or two turned into 2 hours, then 3, and then 4. Slowly, Lester and Petra became completely consumed by the game. Like many other World of Warcraft players, when Lester and Petra saw the trailer for the new World of Warcraft Cataclysm, they looked forward to its release. On December 7th, 2010, just over 6 months after Lester and Petra shut themselves off from the world, the Cataclysm expansion launched. Now at that point, the couple had already neglected the daily chores that every home needs to keep it running, but they continued playing their game. A year went by and the neighbors saw very little of Lester and Petra, or the girls. Grace McGee, a neighbor who lived 2 doors down, sometimes saw a little face looking out the window. They would quickly disappear. She hadn't seen the little girl outside in ages and was becoming more concerned. But behind the closed door, Lester and Petra were still playing their game. And by May 2011, the condition inside their house had only gotten worse. There were crumbs, dust, cobwebs, dirt, and mold that had spread from the appliances to walls to floors. And by the end of 2011, the toilets weren't even working anymore, but it didn't stop them from playing World of Warcraft. By 2012, the house was falling apart on the inside. Filth, poor hygiene, and nutrition had taken their toll on everyone in the house. And this was also the year that little Clara should have been enrolled in school, but she wasn't, and it has been 2 years since she was allowed to last play outside. But Lester and Petra were still playing World of Warcraft. Eventually, 3 years later, on Monday, May 20th, 2013, Grace picked up the phone and called the Anaheim Police Department. This time, she managed to convince someone to do a welfare check at the Huffmeyer home, and when officers arrived, they entered the front door, and the smell they experienced was unbearable. But they made their way slowly through the home, and there they found filthy dishes and appliances that clearly hadn't been cleaned in a while. And as they entered the hallways, they carefully worked their way around piles of trash. The plumbing in the house still did not work, and human waste was smeared across the walls, doors, and floors. Officers then found a stuffed teddy bear, and near it, they found a pile of items that had been used during intimate acts for protection. Everything in the house was basically dirty, and if that wasn't horrific enough, things only got worse when they came face to face with the little girls. The condition that Clara and Lily were in was heartbreaking. Both girls were malnourished, and their teeth were damaged beyond repair. Their hair was dirty and matted, and their little feet were crusted with years of dirt. Now the girls were removed from the home immediately and placed in protective custody, and their neighbor Grace watched it all happen. She later told NBC4 News that she'd suspected something was wrong for years, and that she'd reported her concerns to the helpline for children who were in trouble more than once, and eventually convinced police to check the home. She also said the kids didn't look good, and were frightened when the police officers took them out of the home. Now Lester and Petra were immediately arrested and taken to the Anaheim police station, and 2 days later, on May 22nd, 2013, Lester pleaded not guilty to the crimes he'd been charged with, and the following day, Friday, Petra did the same. Then 11 days later, on May 31st, the Orange County District Attorney filed charges against both of them, and they were held on a $100,000 bail. The charges against them included treating children unlawfully, false imprisonment because the girls were neglected and locked up for years while they played WoW, and keeping the children out of school. Then, because the girls were seriously injured, extra charges were added. The main charges alone meant that Lester and Petra could be sentenced to 7 years in prison. The only time the district attorney's office put the girls' experience into words was when Tony Rocauco's office described Clara and Lily as virtually ignored and forced to live in a harsh, unhealthy environment. The headline of the Los Angeles Times read, "A World of Warcraft obsessed couple and children living in filth." Whether they were addicted to World of Warcraft was never proved in court. Now for 14 months after they'd been arrested, Lester and Petra said that they had done absolutely nothing wrong. But finally on Tuesday, August 5th, 2014, at the Orange County Superior Court in California, the couple pleaded guilty to everything, including all the extra charges. On Tuesday, August 12th, Judge Craig Robinson then sentenced both Lester and Petra. Lester was sentenced to 5 years in California State Prison, and Petra received 3 years and 4 months. Now, the day after the judge sentenced both of them, KTLA News posted on Facebook about the case, and people responded to the post. Some had questions, and others were simply just enraged. How can parents be like this nowadays? This should teach you all to not let your kids be on the computer 24/7. How did they pay for internet and WoW subscription? Lol. Something's seriously wrong with these people. They have to have mental problems. Those girls are going to need intense therapy if they are even to stand a chance at being normal. Poor babies. Now, after years of subjecting 2 girls to horrific living conditions, under California law, good behavior in prison could have their sentence reduced by up to 50%, meaning Petra likely walked out around mid-2016 and Lester mid-2017. But there has been no further news about either of them ever since. Now, when the door of that mobile home closed in May of 2010, those 2 girls' worlds closed with it, until someone acted and the door was forced open. Just when you think that nothing can be worse than child neglect, the next case cost more than 1 human their life as they knew it.
You could just go home and then just turn on a console and boom, you're not inside your room anymore.
One night in July 2012, the people who lived on Stewart Street in Peterborough, Ontario, Canada, heard loud shouting, and while the street was usually a busy one, the noise was not coming from the street, but from inside an apartment building. And tonight, one of the residents in that building was going to do something about that noise. Peterborough, a city of around 80,000 people, is about 77 miles northeast of Toronto. And within that city is Stewart Street, a place with a long history of arson, robberies, and break-ins. 21-year-old Justin Williams lived at 335 Stewart Street, and on the Wednesday evening on July 11, 2012, he was playing his favorite game, World of Warcraft. Justin was deep in a match, and he screamed through his headset at other WoW players while a friend sat nearby. The shouting was so loud and relentless that it was disturbing the neighbors. Some of them did their best to ignore the noise and make the best of the evening, but one of Justin's neighbors, 21-year-old Jordan Kelly Osborne, had finally had enough of it. Jordan marched up to Justin's apartment, walked right in and told him, "There's no need for you to be freaking out about World of Warcraft, it's just a game." Immediately, Justin responded, "It's not just a game, it's my life." Almost as quickly as he answered, he grabbed Jordan by the throat, punched him in the face, and stabbed him in the center of his chest. Jordan broke free from Justin's grip and ran. Jordan then called for help and was transported to the Peterborough Regional Health Center where his stab wound was treated. Fortunately, his injury was not life-threatening, so he was allowed to go home that same day. Peterborough police also arrived that evening and arrested Justin in his apartment. He was then charged with 2 offenses under the Canadian Criminal Code: attack with a weapon and a violent attack, which meant that he could go to prison for up to 14 years. The next morning, Tuesday, July 12, 2012, Justin stood before a judge in the Peterborough Provincial Court. Jordan was interviewed by reporters the same day and told them, "I was sitting in my house today thinking, should I be dead or shouldn't I?" Then he added, "Like they say, it takes over your life, man." After the first news coverage, the case sort of disappeared from the public record. The entertainment website Top 10s rated the case as one of the top 10 crimes caused by video games in 2013. And on Reddit, the case came to life in a different way, with a different kind of audience. People shared their own experiences with the game. "I was playing WoW for a while, and one night my wife brought me dinner, and I got annoyed with her about it, as I was in a raid. That was the WTF moment. Dropped it and never looked back. I remember mid/late 2000s not having internet, so taking my laptop to the Burger King downtown and sitting on the floor of the vestibule after they closed and using the free Wi-Fi until about half an hour before they opened, just to play World of Warcraft on workdays on a military base. It was pretty pathetic in hindsight. My ex let me stand outside our apartment building freezing in the cold during a blizzard for 30 minutes because he was busy playing WoW. He then had the gall to be mad at me for disturbing him while playing. I was so furious I thought I was about to rip his head off." But while Justin sort of disappeared, the story didn't quite finish there for Jordan, who tried to get some peace and quiet one night. 4 years later, Jordan's name was back in the news. Jordan was friends with a woman named Samantha Hall, a local drug dealer. Samantha's neighbor, Terry Pringle, was a 42-year-old father of 3, and they shared the same landlord. Terry had told the landlord that Samantha was selling drugs to a local biker gang, and when Samantha found out, she became angry and arranged for Jordan and another person, who was not an adult yet, to rough Terry up and offered them $60 worth of cocaine in return. And so about 4 years after being stabbed himself, on Saturday, November 26, 2016, 24-year-old Jordan and his accomplices entered Terry's home on Stewart Street and hit him over and over again with a hammer. They did not just rough him up a little, because hours later, he was found lifeless on the floor of his apartment. The force of their blows with the hammer was so bad that they forced him to leave this earth. 5 days after the murder, Jordan had been identified as one of the people involved in the crime, and he was arrested. Then on Tuesday, February 12, 2019, Jordan was found guilty of committing a planned murder and sentenced to life with no possibility of parole for 25 years. Terry's family were understandably devastated and brought his ashes to the courtroom. Now Jordan walked into a stranger's apartment to stop an argument and nearly lost his life, but didn't, and then committed a crime that ended someone else's life. In the next case, an entire family's future depended on one man stopping a game.
This is Yassine. When we met him, he was in treatment for what he calls gaming addiction.
I'd probably play for like about 8 to 10 hours a day.
Everything seemed normal when a mother from Georgia entered her home on January 16, 2009. The family planned to go to her mother's house that evening, but what she didn't know was that those plans were going to suddenly change. Christy and Andrew Warner lived in Kingston, Georgia, where 29-year-old Andrew worked as a sailor at the naval submarine base Kings Bay. Together, they were raising 3 daughters, aged 4, 6, and 8. In September of 2008, Christy hadn't been feeling well and thought that she might be pregnant, so she went to the doctor. The doctor examined her and told her that she wasn't, but that her body wasn't making enough progesterone, a hormone that helps control a woman's menstrual cycle and also supports pregnancy. The doctor described her birth control pills, so she went home and started taking them. On Tuesday, October 28, 2008, sharp cramps then twisted through her lower abdomen. At first, the pain came and went, but soon it grew more frequent and stronger. The pain then spread into her lower back and was so intense that she had to stop and breathe through each wave. The pressure kept building, and Christy paced through the house, leaning on the wall and then the kitchen counter at times as another surge of pain hit. Before long, she understood what was happening. She was definitely pregnant and was in full-blown labor. Within a few hours, she gave birth at home to an 8-pound, 2-ounce baby who they named Brandon. The family was already battling to get by, and now they had a newborn no one had planned for to think of. Kirsty was overwhelmed and started looking into adoption. She contacted both the Georgia Department of Family and Children's Services and Navy social workers, but her mother urged the couple to keep the baby. All we had to do was love him, she told them, and that was what the family did. Over the next 11 weeks and 3 days that followed, Andrew grew especially close to Brandon, often spending more time with him than his daughters. But Andrew also had another obsession, World of Warcraft, and some days he'd play the game for 5 to 7 hours at a time. On Friday, January 16, 2009, Christy went shopping with her mother and left Andrew at home to look after Brandon. Andrew fed him a bottle and then played with him for about 20 minutes. He was an infant, so Brandon couldn't do much besides look up at his father. A short while later, Andrew put him down for a nap. He walked through to the bedroom and placed Brandon face down on the couple's bed. He put pillows around his son so that he wouldn't roll off the bed and hurt himself, something they'd done with all the kids. And once Brandon had settled, Andrew went to the computer. At approximately 12:30 p.m., Andrew logged into World of Warcraft, and for a while the house was quiet. Then Brandon started to cry. Andrew heard the cries coming from the bedroom, but he ignored them. Andrew was in the middle of his game, so he kept playing, and then at some point, he couldn't say exactly when, Andrew got up to use the bathroom. He walked down the hall, past the bedroom, glanced inside, and noticed a pillow covering Brandon's head. He stood there for a moment, then turned around and walked straight back to his computer, continuing to play. Mid-afternoon, Christy called home to check in, and one of their daughters answered. She told Christy that Andrew was on the sofa, feeding the baby, not on the computer. Christy came back home at around 4:30 p.m. She came through the front door and put the groceries down, and walked right past the bedroom where Brandon was sleeping. Nothing in the house seemed out of the ordinary. She was in a hurry, because she still needed to get Brandon ready to go for dinner at her parents' house. She entered the room and walked up to the bed, but when she reached Brandon, she got the shock of her life. He was limp and unresponsive. Christy, of course, totally freaked out, rushed to the phone and called 911, and Andrew, despite his Navy CPR training, froze when he needed to help his son. During that call, Christy told the dispatcher that Brandon was in his bassinet beside the bed, but he wasn't. When officers arrived at Christy and Andrew's home, they immediately started to give Brandon CPR, and then rushed him to a hospital in St. Mary's, Georgia. The first autopsy that was done on Brandon was inconclusive, and the case sat in limbo for 6 months. But then, in July 2009, the final report came back. Brandon had left this earth because he'd suffocated, and that's when NCIS agents brought Andrew in for questioning. He was cooperative and gave a clear account of his day. He said that he checked on Brandon multiple times and given him a pacifier. At one point, he'd also walked past the bedroom and noticed the baby had scooted his head partly under a pillow. So he went in, moved it, and found Brandon breathing fine. He'd said he'd spent most of the afternoon watching music videos and that he hadn't logged into the game until after 3:30 p.m. And by then, Christy was nearly home. But then the investigators pulled Andrew's computer logs, and his story then fell apart. Andrew had in fact logged into World of Warcraft right after Christy left home, at 12:30 p.m, not 3:30 like he'd said. And once investigators had this new information, they brought Andrew in for questioning yet again. But this time his story was a little different. Andrew admitted that he logged onto World of Warcraft at 12:30 p.m. He also said that he heard Brandon crying and hadn't gotten up. He told the investigators that he'd simply lost track of time and genuinely didn't know how long the baby had been crying for. He also admitted that when he walked past the bedroom and saw the pillow covering his son's head, he didn't go in. During the questioning when referring to the World of Warcraft game, he even said, "There's no way to pause it." So far, the investigators had been treating Brandon's death as a possible incident, but after that admission, everything changed. In February 2010, a jury in the Camden County Superior Court charged Andrew on 4 charges. On involuntary manslaughter, which means that through careless or reckless behavior, he caused another person to stop living, second-degree cruelty to children, reckless conduct, and making false statements. Christy was also held accountable for her actions, because she had made false statements during her call to 911 on that day that Brandon died. But prosecutors later promised to drop those charges if she testified at trial. Andrew's trial began on Wednesday, March 30th, 2011, in Camden County Superior Court. The judge in the trial was Judge Anthony Harrison, and it lasted only 2 days. Assistant District Attorney Katie Udi prosecuted the case. She told the jury that this was a case about the failure to act, to take the minimal steps needed to make sure the baby could breathe. Katie explained to the court step by step what had caused Brandon's death. Defense attorney Randy Sorensen argued that the boy's death was a tragic accident and explained that the Warners were stomach-sleeper parents who often placed their children face down. Now Christy took the stand herself and told the court that Andrew was a loving father, but in almost the same breath, she said that it seemed he spent more time with World of Warcraft than he did with us. Now the jury discussed the case for just about 2.5 hours before they came to a decision. Then on Friday, April 1st, 2011, 8 women and 4 men found Andrew Warner guilty on all 4 counts. Before sentencing, Andrew addressed the court and said, "I've had to live with it every day, over and over. I feel remorse, not just for doing something wrong, but for putting my family through this." He asked for probation and said that he'd already lost his son, family, and Navy career, because the Navy would of course discharge him after the conviction. On Wednesday, May 11, 2011, the judge sentenced Andrew under Georgia's first offender statute, a law that gives someone a lesser sentence or a chance to avoid a criminal record if it is their first offense. All in all, he was sentenced to 10 years in total, 3 years in prison and then another 7 on probation. His probation conditions included a ban on owning or playing any video game or online game console. Andrew didn't check on his child soon enough, which led to a heartbreaking consequence. But the next case is about a well-known man in the gaming scene whose entire life changed after he drove into a parking garage.
Tim, why did you target them? If you want to have a relationship with a woman, why not get online and develop that? And he said, because they're easy.
It was the early hours of the morning on Thursday, January 31st, 2019, and a man took a short road trip of 17 miles. He was driving south on Georgia State Route 400. He was on his way to meet a girl he'd been chatting with all night. They both knew what he was coming for. Thomas Ho-Yan Chung was 32 from Alpharetta, Georgia. He was a familiar face in the online gaming world and showed up at Twitch streams and YouTube videos and had almost 20,000 followers on Twitter. He also appeared on BlizzCon panels at Blizzard Entertainment's annual fan events, where the creators of their games explained updates, answered questions, and shared their future plans. On top of that, he also attended charity events. Online, Thomas was known as LV and LFLOL and was known for his popular World of Warcraft gold-making tutorials. On YouTube, he had 34,000 subscribers and a reputation as the go-to educator in the gaming world. Thomas joined Hi-Res Studios full-time in April 2018 to manage communities for Smite and Paladin Strike. But outside of work, he was also active on a messaging app called Whisper, and there he connected with a girl, someone I'll call Amy. Now, she was still not of age, and he knew that. The relationship between Thomas and Amy developed pretty quickly, and soon they were messaging one another regularly. He told her that he wanted to meet her and be intimate with her, and that he didn't use protection. A few days earlier, Thomas had asked Amy to meet him at the parking lot of a Kroger on Johnson Ferry Road in Brookshaven, Georgia, and she agreed. Their meeting was set for Thursday, January 31st, 2019 at 12:45 a.m., which was only a 30-minute drive from Alpharetta. Now, when Thomas reached the parking lot, someone approached his vehicle, but it wasn't Amy. He'd actually driven right into Operation Interception, a months-long multi-agent sting led by the Georgia Internet Crimes Against Children Task Force and the Georgia Bureau of Investigation. During the time that Thomas had been talking to Amy, he was actually speaking to trained agents that were posing as young people on the messaging app. The entire goal of Operation Interception was to identify adults who communicated online with people who were not adults themselves, spoke to them in inappropriate ways, and traveled to meet them. Every person arrested during Operation Interception believed they were meeting a person that wasn't on their age level. When Thomas parked his car, officers moved in, arrested him, and then booked him into DeKalb County Jail on Saturday, February 2nd, 2019. He was charged under Georgia law for using a computer service to get a person who is younger than the legal required age to be inappropriate with him, a serious crime carrying up to 20 years in prison and a $25,000 fine.
As the GBI released a list of 21 men arrested in the GBI listed Thomas Chiang as a 32-year-old gaming studio employee.
On Wednesday, February 6, 2019, at 3:05 in the morning, Thomas posted $10,000 bail and walked out of DeKalb County Jail. As his life as he knew it crumbled around him, he made no statements and gave no interviews and went silent online. 2 days after his arrest, the news went public, and once it did, 7 years of hard work and community building were gone. Within 24 hours, SteelSeries dropped his sponsorship, and his Twitch partner status was cancelled. Then Hi-Res Studios also fired him, and the company's CEO, Stuart Chisholm, made a public statement that confirmed Thomas had been fired on Monday, February 4th, 2019. On Monday, February 4th, we learned through local news that Thomas Chung was arrested in an operation by the Georgia Bureau of Investigation. At this point, we know only what has been reported in the local news and by law enforcement, and cannot comment on specifics of Mr. Chung's case, other than to say that, as of today, Mr. Chung is no longer employed by Hi-Res Studios. He continued, "As a parent, it is difficult to imagine more disturbing allegations than those laid out in the news reports. We commend the efforts of the Georgia Bureau of Investigation and other law enforcement to protect our state's and to send a strong message that the behavior targeted in their Operation Interception will not be tolerated in Georgia." Then on Tuesday, February 5th, esports journalist Rod Slasher Breslow posted about Thomas's arrest on Twitter, and the responses from Rod's followers included, "I don't know if I'm surprised because I've met this guy, but wow, this is kinda nuts. An ally has been slain." Alec Hinz, a web developer who worked with Chung on an unofficial BlizzCon website, said, "I was disgusted and instantly overwhelmed. I think the people who know him feel the same way I do." Now, one of Thomas's previous followers, Dravy, shared something that hasn't been independently verified, but here's what he said. Dravy said, "I'm not even remotely shocked about the allegations coming out. The person in question attempted to force me into getting passionate with them at BlizzCon. The only reason why I got out was I sent a bunch of messages to people, between him taking my phone away and someone DM'd me back." She added, "When I tried to dip out of his hotel room, he basically wouldn't let me politely leave, and did everything he could to keep me with him for the night. This was a person who was my friend for 5 years. I'm sickened but not shocked, and I'm sad for the kids." In December 2019, the DeKalb County District Attorney Sherry Boston announced the criminal charges against 24 men who were arrested during the Operation Interception. Now, Thomas pleaded guilty to the charges against him, and on April 10, 2025, U.S. District Judge Thomas P. Barber sentenced him to 11 years and 3 months in prison. And when Thomas is released, he will have to become a listed offender. Now, this predator was exposed by an organized sting, but the next predator didn't need a sting to expose him. He did it with a headset and an in-game character and calculated grooming.
Parents usually feel that kids living under their roof enjoy a layer of protection. But if they can get online, then danger could just be a few clicks away.
It was late 2014, and somewhere in Pennsylvania, Abby was at her computer. The rest of the house was quiet, because her family had gone to bed already. Abby was a pretty average teen, and she loved to play World of Warcraft. In the game, she had a unique username, guild, and even online friends, some of whom she'd never met in real life before. Now, one of those online friends was a person who lived 1,400 miles away in Wichita, Kansas. His name was Tommy Lee Jones, and he seemed like a pretty friendly guy. At first, they only knew each other by their online usernames and chatted like many other people on the same server did. But as Abby started to feel more comfortable with Tommy, she told him her real name and even where she lived. Then their conversations changed a little. Instead of chatting in World of Warcraft chats, they moved over to Skype, and that's where their chats became personal and somewhat inappropriate. Tommy told Abby that he was 26 years old, and Abby told him her age. But although she was under the legal age, he continued to talk to her over Skype inappropriately. It didn't bother him. Sometime during their chats, he opened the gallery on his phone and created a new folder which he named Abby. Then on Thursday, November 6, 2014, Abby and her mom, who I'll call Rachel, had an argument. The kind that happens between teens and parents in most homes. Now Abby and Rachel exchanged words, but this time Abby didn't go to her room, shut the door and simply cooled off. Instead, she took her mom's credit card and went onto the internet, bought a one-way bus ticket to Wichita and packed a few things in a small bag before leaving the family home. Now when Rachel realized that Abby had left the house and that she'd used her credit card, she called the police, who responded and stopped her from boarding the bus to Wichita. But that wasn't the end of the story for Abby, because the police wanted answers from her, who she was going to meet. Wichita police and Sedgwick County detectives stepped in and, working through the Internet Crimes Against Children Task Force, traced Tommy, and when they eventually found him, they took Tommy's phone, went through it, and discovered the Abby folder. And when police opened the folder, in it they found very intimate photographs of her, which they then showed to Rachel, who was shocked because she had no idea that her daughter had been photographed. There were also 2 other photos of Abby, and in them she was only wearing a black shirt that had been pulled over her shoulders. Rachel went through each photo in the folder and confirmed that they were of Abby, and that some of them had even been taken in the bathroom of their own house. Now detectives then checked Tommy's Skype account and read the messages that Tom and Abby had been sending to each other, and there were messages that he'd sent to other people too. 2 days after Abby bought the bus ticket, he messaged someone saying that he was worried about her because she had left home for Wichita and that he hadn't heard from her, and because she was so young. This message proved that he knew exactly how old she actually was. The FBI then got involved with the case and took things a step further. They reached out to Tommy's parole officer and an in-depth investigation was opened. And when Tommy was questioned, he said that it was Abby who turned the Skype conversations inappropriate, and that she'd removed items that covered her for her safety, and that he'd never seen her with everything entirely removed. He also admitted that he would sometimes do stuff to himself after their video chats. Now the parole officer understood what it meant. A registered offender who had committed intimate crimes had been in contact with someone he was legally not allowed to be around. This was actually not the first time that Tommy had been in this kind of trouble with the law. He'd been found guilty in 2009 for committing 2 inappropriate crimes against a girl that was younger than you might think. Once he was convicted and sentenced, he went to prison for 5 years, until he was released on parole. Under Kansas law, those convictions led to what was called the aggravated habitual intimate offender law. This law meant that people with more than one personal intimate crime conviction against a young person could get a life sentence without parole at all. And after Tommy was released on parole on July 24, 2014, he was registered as a person who commits personal intimate crimes and returned to Wichita, and sometime after he opened his computer, became a World of Warcraft player, connected with others, and eventually Abby. And despite the fact that he knew Abby was a younger person, they shared very intimate conversations, and she eventually shared images of herself. And so when the authorities learned of this, his 2009 convictions and SO status came back to haunt him. Now, the 30-year-old, if found guilty of the charges against him, could spend the rest of his life in jail. Now, the case went to trial in Sedgwick County District Court. Tommy's defense came down to 2 claims. He thought Abby was over 18 and he never saw her fully unclothed, but the jury found him guilty and he was convicted on all 4 counts. Now, Judge Joe Kisner sentenced Tommy on Tuesday, July 10, 2018, and at 30 years old, Tommy would spend the rest of his life in prison. But on the legal side of things, Tommy did try to appeal his conviction, and almost 3 years later, Tommy's appeal was actually heard by the Kansas Supreme Court on Wednesday, May 26. As the session began, his defense attorney, Michelle Davis, opened the case by saying that Tommy had played an online game, and his character played another character, which he at first thought was a guy. Now on Friday, August 6, about 3 months later, the Kansas court actually ruled on Tommy's appeal, and while the judges did not initially agree on every legal detail, in the end they decided to throw out 2 of his 4 convictions because of a major mistake in his trial. The appeals court found that the jury was given the wrong instructions. They were told that they all had to agree on which specific images of Abby were illegal. Under Kansas law though, this was incorrect. Every juror must agree that a crime was committed, but they don't all have to pick the same specific photo as the reason for their decision. And because of this confusion, the court overturned those 2 charges. So at the end of the appeal, 2 of Tommy's convictions still remained. And because of the repeat offender penalty, 2 meant he would still spend the rest of his life in prison. Now Tommy found Abby through a screen and never got close enough. But in the next case, the danger didn't stop at the screen. It followed someone who was young right to her front door.
Extortion's on the rise. The National Center for Missing and Exploited tip line tells us that last year it received 36.2 million reports of suspected child exploitation online.
A girl from Lima, Ohio, was playing World of Warcraft in January 2024. She was miles from home, in a strange town, and had not been outdoors in days. But she was perfectly okay with that, or so she thought. Michaela Buckner was a young person who lived with her mom, Jennifer Johns, on Mandolin Drive, American Township. She had severe scoliosis, a condition where the spine curves sideways instead of staying straight. This condition made it almost impossible for her to travel alone. Like many people, playing World of Warcraft was one of her favorite escapes. One day in late December 2023, while she was playing, she connected with Thomas Allen Abersol, who lived about 1,000 miles away. Thomas was from Dullanan, Florida, a town about 90 miles north of Tampa, and much like Michaela, World of Warcraft was a big part of his life. At first, Thomas and Michaela spoke through the World of Warcraft chat features, but quite quickly their conversation moved over to a free messaging app where people connect, Discord. Soon the 2 created pet names for each other, Little Wolf, Darlin, Baby Girl, Beautiful, and Babe. It didn't take long before they spoke about meeting in person too, hooking up, and even Thomas' future plans to marry her and keep her hidden from anyone who came looking. In their messages, Thomas said that he knew she was a young person, and he knew that what he was planning was illegal, but that didn't stop him. On Wednesday, December 27, 2023, Thomas locked up his house, got into his 2019 Nissan, and started the engine. He had a long 14-hour drive to Lima, Ohio ahead of him. Now Michaela knew Thomas was on his way to see her, and throughout the trip, he sent her updates over Discord. 856 miles to go, 12 hours LOL, almost out of Florida. Thomas finally reached Lima on Thursday, December 28, 2020, and when he did, he drove directly to Mandolin Drive and stopped his car. Michaela, who had been waiting for him, opened the door and got in his car. Thomas then turned around and drove back to his house in Dullanan. Now that same evening, Jennifer came home from work, only to find that something was wrong. Michaela wasn't here. Jennifer knew that it was impossible that Michaela could have left alone, so she immediately called the Lima Police Department and opened a missing persons report. Late that same evening, when Thomas and Michaela arrived in Dullanan, Michaela walked inside Thomas's home, and he closed the door behind them. The missing person report that Jennifer had made earlier that day had triggered a multi-agency manhunt. The Lima Police Department, the Ohio Bureau of Criminal Investigation, and the FBI had all teamed up and were working on the case. Authorities pulled surveillance footage, tracked cell phone data, ran through witness interviews, and dug into online records. But as the days passed, every lead went cold, until the FBI pulled World of Warcraft server logs and made their discovery. Michaela's account, last active in Lima, had been logged into again, but this time from Dullanan, Florida. The investigators then traced the logins to an IP address at the 2300 block of Shorewood Drive in Dullanan, Florida. Then once the FBI had an address, they reached out to the Marion County Sheriff's Office and spoke to Detective Henrik Osted. They told him that they had a missing girl from Ohio and needed the department's help, and Henrik agreed. On Wednesday, January 3rd, 2024, Henrik drove to the house on Shorewood Drive and knocked on the door. And not long after he knocked, Thomas opened the front door. Henrik immediately saw that he had 3 hickeys on his neck. Now Henrik greeted Thomas and asked if he knew where Michaela was. Now at first, Thomas denied knowing her, but ultimately hung his head, turned around, and said that he'd be right back. And after a few minutes, Thomas returned, but he wasn't alone. Michaela was standing next to him, and she was frustrated with the entire situation. Thomas then tried to explain the situation to Henrik. He admitted to their relationship and that he was going to hide and later marry Michaela. He also told Henrik that the love spots on his neck were from her. Michaela also cooperated with Henrik and really opened up to him, and admitted that she'd actually asked Thomas to pick her up from her home in Ohio. Henrik simply patiently listened to what she had to say and then reminded her that she wasn't of age. He explained that because of her age, no matter what she said, she could not legally give Thomas consent to do that. And with that, he placed 31-year-old Thomas under arrest and took him to Marion County Jail. Now once Thomas was in police custody, he willingly gave them access to his Discord messages with their plans written out. Michaela, on the other hand, was immediately taken into protective custody, counseled, and then sent back to Ohio, where Jennifer was waiting for her. Now in Florida, Thomas had faced a long list of state charges. The charges included traveling to meet someone who cannot legally give consent to engage in inappropriate activity, interfering with child custody, sheltering an unmarried person who's under the legally required age, 3 counts of unlawful inappropriate activity with an underage person, traveling to meet an underage underage person after using a computer to lure a person out of age, providing aid to an underage person without notifying a parent. Now, Thomas pleaded not guilty to the state's charges against him and said that he hadn't been inappropriate with Michaela. And so on January 11, 2024, something happened that shocked the public. Thomas was released from jail after he posted a $6,000 bail. People were stunned that a man who'd driven to Lima, Ohio, who took a girl who he wasn't allowed to legally be with across state lines and keep her hidden for 6 days, was allowed to walk out of jail. Now, while Thomas was out on bond, the authorities waited for key evidence like DNA tests to be finalized. And then, almost 7 months later, on Thursday, August 8, 2024, he was arrested again. The DNA test results were back, and they proved that Thomas had indeed been intimate with Michaela. This time, the charges against him were not state charges, but federal ones, which carried a much heavier sentence.
Admitted to having a romantic relationship with her and ultimately planning to hide the victim inside of his residence and have her become his wife.
Thomas was formally charged by the U.S. Attorney's Office for the Middle District of Florida on Monday, August 12, 2024. For taking a person out of age across state lines to be inappropriate with, a serious crime that meant that he could spend a minimum of 10 years in prison. The case then moved forward, and in January 2025, Thomas pleaded guilty to the charges. Now, the case was heard by U.S. District Judge Thomas P. Barber, who sentenced him to 11 years and 3 months in prison. And upon his release, Thomas would be required to register as a person who was inappropriate with people and have supervised release conditions. As of early 2026, no appeals or further proceedings had been reported. Now, Michaela is one of the lucky ones who made it home in one piece. But in the next case, World of Warcraft brought 2 strangers together, and one of them never lived to tell their story. A young woman moved to a new city. She had no family or friends there, but she still had her online World of Warcraft friends. She was excited about her new apartment, but what she didn't know was that in 24 hours, one of her online friendships would go horribly wrong, and things in her apartment would turn deadly. 28-year-old Erika Eriksson originally came from Arvika in central Sweden, which was about 236 miles from Hultsfred, the western suburb of Stockholm that she now called home. Stockholm had called her name. New opportunities and her fresh start were exactly what she needed. Erika was a pretty private person, and her social world didn't revolve around bars or colleges. It revolved around the popular game World of Warcraft. Through the game's guild and chat channels, she'd built a great group of friends. And now that she'd left Arvika, that online community was her social life in Stockholm, which suited her just fine. And the very first day that Erika spent in her new apartment in Hultsfred was November 20th, 2009. And the very next day was her birthday. She'd already sent out invites to a small birthday party that she would be having that evening. Many of her World of Warcraft friends had said that they'd be coming. In fact, one of those friends would even be traveling 124 miles just to be there. This friend's name was Tony Mattia. Tony was 33, from Sandviken, and just like Erika, he was a dedicated World of Warcraft player. They'd never met in person. All she knew about him was his in-game username, voice in game chat, and face from a small profile picture he used. But on Saturday evening, November 21st, Erika's apartment filled as her friends stepped through the door one after another. They greeted each other with hugs, laughter, and friendly chatter. For Erika, it felt like things in Stockholm were finally starting to fall into place. And after everyone gathered, the group left her small apartment and made their ways to the Ego Spa in the city to celebrate Erika's birthday. Outside, Stockholm was beautiful and alive with the usual sounds of nightlife. The group spent a few hours at the bar and then made their way back to Erika's apartment. On their way home at 1:47 AM on Sunday, one surveillance camera caught a glimpse of Erika and Tony heading towards an escalator. They were smiling and seemed to be having a good time. Now, once Erika and her friends were back in her apartment, the party continued for a while. But one by one, her guests began to leave. The very last to leave was a young woman in her 20s. I'll call her Amy. On her way out of the apartment, Amy paused at the door and looked back. She could see Erika in her long underwear and Tony. Both of them were fast asleep and everything seemed fine. And so after a few moments, Amy closed the door quietly behind her and left. Now, sometime between 6 and 7 in the morning, something woke Tony up, and he grabbed Erika from behind and locked his arm around her neck. His hold tightened, but she did her best to struggle against him. She twisted her body and fought to breathe. Then, for a brief moment, his grip loosened just enough for her to slip free. There was a brief pause, but then Tony moved toward her again. This time he pulled her into a rear chokehold, the kind where the attacker's right arm wraps tightly around the throat, while the other arm locks it into place from behind. Erika fought to free herself, but his hold was far stronger this time, and within moments, she began to lose her strength, and eventually Erika went limp, and there was silence in the apartment. But the city outside was waking up, and Tony was the only one standing and alive. Now, at that moment, he didn't run. Instead, at around 7 AM, he picked up his phone and called 112, Sweden's emergency number. And when the 112 operator answered, Tony's voice was trembling. "I have strangled her." The dispatcher immediately told him to attempt CPR on Erika, and he did. He also pleaded with her, "Wake up, breathe. Come on, now. The police arrived at Erica's apartment shortly after Tony's call, and he was arrested on the spot. And what followed was a criminal investigation, interviews, forensic work, and a lot of questions. When he was questioned, Tony said that he remembered nothing, and a psychiatric evaluation suggested that he may have had a serious mental disorder. But under Swedish privacy law, the details were sealed, and that gap sat at the center of the case. There was no clear motive, and no drugs involved. Just a man, a woman, an evening of fun, and a moment that couldn't be explained. Investigators never found out if Erica had touched him, spoken to him, or woken him up when she moved nearby. But whatever the trigger was, it was enough to set him off, and for him to take her life. On February 17, 2010, 2 months and 26 days after the killing, Tony finally broke and confessed and said, "I was so angry. I didn't want her to touch me. I just lost control." Tony called Erica's attack an accident. And the early stages of the investigation were handled by prosecutor Christina Voigt, who worked with detectives to try and figure out what really happened that morning inside Erica's apartment. And then as the case moved to trial, prosecutor Zilla Hirsch took over, and Tony was facing a charge for ending someone. The case was heard at the Solna District Court, and Zilla focused on how Erica was killed. She explained to the court that strangulation is not something that just happens in an instant. It takes pressure, control, and time. She said that it's a crime that is slow and deliberate, and in her view shows clear intent. Zilla explained that what Erica would have experienced in those final moments was pressure around her neck, that it would have tightened, and it would have become hard for her to breathe. At the same time, blood flow from her brain was being restricted. Her body would have reacted instinctively, and she would have struggled for air as the hold continued. The process was described as long, painful, and distressing. But the defense said something else. Defense lawyer Tobias Feld represented Tony and argued that there was no planning involved in the crime. Tobias pointed out to the psychiatric evaluations and the chaotic results. He also said that Tony called for help almost right away, which in his view wasn't a planned killing, but a sudden act during a moment of extreme panic. Now once the prosecution and defense had presented their cases, the court came to a decision and gave its verdict. On Tuesday, March 30th, 2010, Tony was convicted of manslaughter, and he was sentenced to 8 years in prison. The court also ordered Tony to pay 23,355 Swedish krona in damages to her estate, and 100,000 to her relatives. Erica's family had to live with that, and when her brother tried to claim damages for the loss of a sister, the court denied his request because they weren't in contact very often. Erica's killer called what caused her to be lifeless an accident. The next case has nothing to do with an accident, but two people that planned one of the most gruesome crimes the country has seen.
14 years since Kimberly Proctor was viciously tortured and killed. Her family says they've yet to see change.
18-year-old Kimberly Patricia Proctor lay asleep in her bed in Langford, British Columbia on Thursday morning, March 18, 2010. Lucy Proctor, Kimberly's mother, slipped quietly into her daughter's room, kissed her goodbye, and then whispered that she loved her and left for work. The previous day, Kimberly learned that she had enough credits to graduate early from high school. Her future looked bright, and she was already planning to volunteer at the local wildlife rehabilitation center. Kimberly had no classes that Thursday, so she stepped in. Lucy knew that she would be heading to her babysitting side job later that afternoon, and then working on a graduation dress when she got home. Kimberly had asked her grandmother to help her with the dress. Now what Lucy didn't know was that Kimberly had other plans before she headed off to her babysitting job. And so when Kimberly woke up, she went about her usual morning routine, and after that she left the family home and headed to the Langford bus exchange. Little did she know that she wouldn't return home. Born on January 1st, 1992, Kimberly grew up in a middle-class home in Langford, British Columbia, a suburban community of about 40,000 people on southern Vancouver Island. Her parents were Lucy and Fred. Lucy managed at a Walmart store, and Fred was a diesel mechanic. Kimberly was their only child, and they called her Baby New Year. Kimberly's friends said that she was a responsible homebody who loved animals. The garage of the family home even became a pet sanctuary. She also adored cats. When she was young, she wore cat ears to school every day. Kimberly was loving, creative, bold, and kind, and her genuine nature is what those closest to her loved most about her. Now, Kimberly's mother said that her daughter was bullied throughout her school life. Children at Kimberly's school teased her about the cat ears she wore, and they would even meow at her in class and in the school hallways. Now, Kimberly also had ADHD, which added to her challenges. She panicked when she made her way through students at school. Fred and Lucy even took her to see a psychiatrist, but that didn't help much. The medication she was given basically turned her into a walking zombie. Now, her parents eventually transferred her to Pacific Secondary School for more one-on-one attention.
And sure enough, it was a great environment for Kimberly. She absolutely thrived there. She made a bunch of friends, she had a solid social circle, and it really felt like she was thriving for the first time in her life.
And between late September and early October, Kimberly and a boy she dated for a few months broke up. And while the relationship with Zach was not a long one, she still felt hurt and vulnerable, and so she leaned on her friends online. especially Cruz Hendrik Wellwood and Cameron Alexander Moffat. During one late-night chat, Cameron told her that he had feelings for her. "There aren't many beautiful things I've seen," he told her, "but you're one of them." "Aw, thanks," Kimberly replied, but her heart wasn't with Cameron. It actually was with Cruz. After her breakup with Zach, they'd grown close. The teens would often text, chat, and belong to the same online social world. Kimberly didn't perceive them as dangerous. Now Cruz was still friends with Zach though, and Kimberly confided in her friend Samantha Kennedy, admitting that dating Cruz might ease the sting of losing Zach. Samantha warned her that if she didn't really like him, she shouldn't lead him on. Kimberly had no idea that the boys she was chatting with, the familiar local faces from Langford, would end up planning something far darker than heartbreak. Cruz and Cameron attended nearby schools. The teenagers had casual, everyday contact, the kind of contact that feels completely harmless, the kind no one ever questions. Now neither Cruz nor Cameron had a happy childhood. Cruz was born January 23, 1994, grew up in Langford, and was 16 years old. He was the son of Robert Raymond DeSwan, who in 2001 received a life sentence for the intimate attack and murder of a 16-year-old, while Cruz was only 7 at the time. Cruz wrote letters to his father while he was in prison and knew of his crimes, but by the time Cruz had turned 12, he stopped contacting him because he hated what his father had done. Now raised by only his mother, Nadine, in a modest 2-bedroom bungalow in Langford, Cruz was an only child. He grew up in a troubled home, and as he got older, he started physically and verbally attacking his mother, who eventually told him she didn't feel safe around him. And from a young age, Cruz already showed troubling signs. He started torturing animals, setting fires, stealing mail, skipping school, and smoking certain drugs. Now before Cruz was even 16, he'd already been arrested for drugs and theft, and at school he'd been reprimanded for hurting other kids. His teacher described Cruz as extremely intelligent, especially with computers, but his behavior in class was often rude and aggressive, so he was often in trouble. Now in February of 2009, Cruz authored a disturbing blog post. The post was entitled "Early Signs of a Serial Killer." In this blog post, he shared that he met several criteria on a known serial killer checklist. This criteria included having abandonment issues and a fascination with dark and creepy intimate visual imagery. He even stated that he felt a compulsion to act on the violent fantasies that he was having. Cruz also made this chilling statement in the post: "The peculiar thing is, I meet all 14 criteria. Apparently though, meeting all criteria makes it unlikely for the subject to be a serial killer. I suppose only time will tell." Then there was Cameron, also known as Cam, Cruz's best friend, born in 1992 in Langford as well, with a sister and 2 half-brothers. At a very young age, Cameron was handled in an appropriate way by an adult, an experience that left him struggling with lifelong rage and trust issues. Like Kimberly, Cameron had ADHD, but while their symptoms were similar, their behavior wasn't. As a child, Cameron had started jumping out his bedroom window at night until it was barred shut. He began lashing out at home and used the blades on himself. He was a menace at school too and would often bring knives to class. Cameron was a slow learner, and though his parents tried counseling and medication, his behavior only worsened. He was also accused of perpetrating non-consensual acts against his former girlfriends. It was also noted that he pushed out his emotions and trauma by escaping into video games, and as he spent more time online, he drifted toward darker spaces, violent forums, graphic imagery, and disturbing material. And things got worse when Cameron became friends with Cruz in 5th grade. Cruz and Cameron bonded over their shared struggles, fascination with violence, and dislike of one teacher. Their connection would even grow stronger over a rather wild 2-year period. During the times the teens would use substances and also indulge in both violence and graphic material. Both teens also played World of Warcraft. Now Cruz and Cameron first met Kimberly in mid to late 2009 and flirted with her. Cruz was 15 and Cameron was 17, and soon the teens started to discuss their fantasies. Over MSN Messenger, a popular instant messaging app, and phone calls, their discussions turned from abstract fantasies to more concrete plans of intimate and life-ending attacks.
Cameron Moffat. I guess we plan for it, but we keep our eyes open. Cruz Wellwood. This is so funny. Jam a funnel in her and fill it with water. When you're done, pour Drano in her. I am going to rip her nose ring out and burn it. Burn her flesh.
On MSN messages, Cameron even said, "I want to get it done. I don't want to wait." Cruz then replied saying, "I'm not killing her right away." Then Cameron said, "Why? You're not going to keep her bound and alive?" When the 2 teens started making their plans, they created different code phrases. One of the code phrases was, "Rip her nose ring out and burn it." This is how they would discuss the attack and how they would get rid of her body without anyone knowing what they were talking about. Then the phrase "make KD," which stands for craft dinner, became the signal that the attack was going to start. Cameron also used the phrase "party in my pants," which you can kind of think about what this means. Now before the crime, Cruz and Cameron even went as far as purchasing camp fuel to burn her. Their planning was pretty meticulous. It even involved creating alibis, gathering supplies, and the perfect timing. And according to NBC News, investigators later found a huge amount of data from their devices, roughly the equivalent of 1.4 billion pages. And these files included chats, images, search histories, and other disturbing online material. On the evening of Wednesday, March 17, 2010, Cruz and Cameron put their plan in motion. Cruz contacted Kimberly via MSN Messenger.
What are you doing tomorrow? Nothing other than babysitting at 3.
Cruz told Kimberly that he was bored and just wanted someone to talk to. He then apologized for what he called the entire Zach fiasco, where he brushed off her feelings as nothing more than teenage drama. He also mentioned how
Cam and me and everyone were so mean,
and the statement was in reference to bullying. Then Cruz types a message to her saying that he would rather talk to her in person. He even goes on to say that he could meet her before a babysitting job and talk to her over a couple of bowls, which is another way to say weed. Cruz hoped Kimberly would take the bait, and she did. Now Kimberly agreed to meet with him, but what she didn't know was that Cameron was eavesdropping on her conversation with Cruz. She also never knew that the tape and the sock gag were ready for the attack that would happen roughly 10 hours later. On Thursday, March 18, 2010, Kimberly headed off to meet Cruz at his home. And when Kimberly arrived at Cruz's home at around 11 AM, the attack on her began. They overpowered her and restrained her with duct tape. A sock was then forced into her mouth. And for hours, they continued to attack her. Cruz and Cameron took turns. And during one brief break to use the bathroom, she begged Cameron for help and promised to do anything if they only let her go. But he refused and showed her no mercy. They then placed her into a chest freezer until she left this earth. And after the horrific attack, both of their messages and online activities showed that they went on with their day, as if nothing unusual had happened. Now on Thursday night at around 9 PM, Lucy already reported Kimberly missing. She did this after receiving a call saying that Kimberly had not arrived at her babysitting job. And upon receiving that call, Lucy felt a great sense of dread. After all, not showing up was not in Kimberly's character at all. Now the police immediately started looking for her. Her families and friends formed search parties that went through every inch of Langford looking for her, but there were no signs of her anywhere. And by this time, Lucy and Fred were frantic with worry. Now the following day, which was Friday, Cruz and Cameron knew that they would have to move Kimberly, and so the teens forced her into a hockey bag and picked her up along with camp fuel and left Cruz's house. The two teenagers then boarded a bus with the Galloping Goose Regional Trail near Souk as their destination, and when they reached the trail, they approached the bridge. Underneath the bridge, they placed the bag on the ground, doused it in camp fuel, and set it alight. And they did this, of course, to destroy evidence of their DNA on her body and the injuries they'd inflicted. And once her remains were nothing but ash, the two boys then went back to their homes as if nothing happened. Later that day, other teenagers discovered the remains. And at around 7 PM, the police received a call informing them that somebody has made a discovery near Galloping Goose Trail. And when they arrived at the scene, all that the officers could tell was that these remains belonged to a woman. Police then contacted Kimberly's parents for her hairbrush and dental records, and thanks to those, the police soon received confirmation that the remains did belong to Kimberly. Now 5 days after the crime took place, Cruz opened a chat inside World of Warcraft, and there he chatted with his online girlfriend and Cameron.
They're like, remorse. Do you feel any remorse? Any regrets? Anything inside of you? Any remorse? Regrets? Any remorse? Any remorse? Remorse? Did you feel remorse?
During the chat, Cruz confessed to the savage crime that he and Cameron had recently committed. He even went as far as sending his online girlfriend links to news articles about Kimberly's disappearance, and Cruz described the attack in graphic detail, calling it fun. Now Cameron joined the chat and said,
"She screamed, but we gagged her. No regrets, adrenaline rush."
Now police did zoom in on Cruz and Cameron. Investigators looked closely at all the people Kimberly had been closest to online and at school, and the teens were under their radar. And as investigators searched their personal devices, they of course recovered massive amounts of digital information, including private World of Warcraft chat logs, messages, search histories, and disturbing online conversations. Now these chat logs became an important part of the case because they showed conversations about Kimberly along with violent fantasies and cruel language that helped investigators understand what had been happening behind the scenes. Now during the investigation, after obtaining judicial authorization, police bugged Cruz and Cameron's digital devices to monitor their conversations and online activity. Now Cruz would even attend Kimberly's memorial service, and witnesses said that he was skipping happily on that day. Now almost 3 months later, on June 18, 2010, Cruz and Cameron were arrested and put in a bugged police van. And while in the van, the teens compared notes about what they had told the police, and Cruz even bragged about the crime. Now following a 9-hour interrogation, Cameron confessed and gave details of the attack on Kimberly. And now in interviews, the two blamed each other for what they'd done to Kimberly. In court, the prosecutors argued that the teens were equally guilty though, as they'd worked together and not alone. Now, police investigations showed that Cruz was the main architect of the attack. He was the one who lured Kimberly to his home and then used the code phrase,
"I'm going to make some KD."
Cruz was the one who signaled to Cameron that the plan was in action, and Cameron simply joined in, participating in the prolonged attack that ended Kimberly's life. Now, on October 18, 2010, Cruz, 17 years old, and Cameron, 18 years old, pleaded guilty to first-degree murder, meaning that Kimberly's murder was intentional and planned. The court read a 5-page agreed statement of facts signed by the Crown and defense lawyers. Now, Cruz remained mostly quiet in court and looked down at the floor. At times, he furrowed his brow and even looked as though he were fighting for tears. Now, Cameron stared straight ahead of him at the judge. When his sentence was read, he had an expression that ranged between anger and a childlike pout. But then he made eye contact with Cruz. Now, during the trial, various psychologists and psychiatrists testified. Experts labeled the teens as psychopaths and intimate sadists, and said that they had little to no capacity for remorse. They also said there was almost no chance that they would be rehabilitated in the next 25 to 30 years. And so both teens were tried and sentenced as adults for planned and intentional murder. The ruling was delivered in a little more than 1 hour. Mr. Justice Robert Johnston sentenced the teens to life in prison, with no possibility of parole for a minimum of 10 years. This was the maximum penalty under Canadian law for criminals charged with planned and intentional murder. Now, the judge also sentenced each teen to an additional 5 years on separate charges for committing an indignity to a human body. Now, both teens said that they regretted the crimes that they committed, but neither the court nor Kimberly's family really believed them. And after sentencing, both Cruz and Cameron were transferred to adult prisons.
They have no right to be protected. The general public has the right to know who these two monsters are.
Now, Cruz and Cameron have both tried to get parole, but so far they've all been denied. In 2023, prison staff also found more than 100 graphic drawings in Cruz's cell. They showed torture and violent as well as sadistic scenes. And because of those images and the fact that he was forcefully intimate with another inmate, the parole board still sees him as a danger to the public. Now, both Cruz and Cameron are still serving their time in prison today for committing one of the most gruesome murders in Canadian history.